I'm going to say one thing. Fuck Trump.
The energy in the room was already intense before Robert De Niro even began speaking. You could feel it building, that sharp electric tension that comes right before something significant is said, even if no one yet knew exactly. Cameras were locked in, the audience packed tightly together, and the air carried that heavy silence that signals a shift. And De Niro stepped forward and did something many politicians, executives, and media figures seemed too hesitant to do. He spoke plainly. There was no polished messaging, no strategic phrasing, no attempt to protect relationships or maintain access. He spoke as someone who had observed Donald Trump for decades and had simply run out of patience. That's what made the moment feel risky, even dangerous. This wasn't a reaction to a single headline or controversy. It was something deeper, more accumulated. When pressed about trust, the tone sharpened. "I don't trust anyone," he said, not as a dramatic line, but as a reflection of a broader frustration. And when asked why even engage, the answer wasn't simple, because this wasn't about one person or one moment. It was about a pattern, a long, visible pattern of intimidation, cruelty, ego, and disorder presented as leadership. De Niro described Trump as someone driven by insecurity, a malignant narcissist, a figure who projects his own weaknesses outward onto others. The crowd responded to the bluntness, but what truly landed was the conviction behind it. He didn't sound like he was performing. He sounded certain, and that certainty carried more weight than any insult ever could. That certainty is what made the reaction so explosive. Donald Trump has always known how to handle insults. In many ways, he feeds off them. He can escalate, deflect, and transform criticism into spectacle. But conviction is something else entirely, especially when it comes from someone like Robert De Niro, a figure with enough influence to command attention, enough experience to recognize patterns, and nothing left to prove to anyone. De Niro argued that Trump's entire persona was built on performance, an act carefully maintained over time. He suggested that the so-called strongman image was not strength at all, but insecurity amplified. That idea hit hard because it reframed everything people thought they understood. For years, Trump had cultivated an image of dominance, confidence, and control. But De Niro stripped that image down to something far more fragile, a man deeply concerned with how he is perceived, constantly seeking validation from those he simultaneously distrusts. That shift in perspective carried weight, especially given the timing. The country was already under strain, economic pressure rising, global tensions increasing, and a general sense of exhaustion settling over the public. Even within Trump's own political circle, there were signs of cracks forming. Voices that once defended him without hesitation were beginning to sound uncertain, even frustrated. Into that moment, De Niro delivered a message that felt less like commentary and more like a warning. He pushed further, arguing that Trump lacked empathy, that he didn't truly understand people or their struggles. Instead, he portrayed him as someone driven by self-interest, image, and retaliation, treating others not as citizens, but as tools, either to be used, dismissed, or attacked. At that point, the tone in the room shifted again. What started as a bold celebrity statement began to feel more serious, almost like an alarm being sounded. That was the moment everything tipped. What had started as a charged statement now carried the weight of something bigger. And as expected, Donald Trump responded in the only way he knows how, immediately and aggressively. The reaction followed a familiar pattern, a flood of angry posts, personal attacks, and dismissive remarks. He labeled Robert De Niro as irrelevant, unstable, washed up, the usual language he reaches for when he feels challenged. It was less about addressing the criticism and more about discrediting the person delivering it. Because if the messenger can be made to look foolish, then maybe the message loses its power. But in this case, the strategy seemed to backfire. Every response only reinforced the original point. If the words truly didn't matter, they could have been ignored, but they weren't. Instead, the reaction became intense, almost obsessive, and that's where the deeper pattern became visible. When something doesn't land, it fades. But when it hits a nerve, it lingers. It gets repeated, amplified, turned into a fixation. The more Trump pushed back, the more attention the criticism received. The cycle fed itself. De Niro appeared to understand this dynamic. He didn't engage in a back-and-forth exchange. He didn't turn it into a personal feud. Instead, he expanded the frame. He positioned Trump not as an individual opponent, but as a broader risk. Someone who confuses fear with authority and control with respect. Someone who demands loyalty not because it's earned, but because it's enforced. That distinction mattered because it shifted the focus away from personality clashes and towards something more structural, the way power is presented and perceived. And while Trump continued reacting loudly and publicly, De Niro remained steady. His tone didn't spiral. His message didn't change. That contrast began to stand out. That contrast is what ultimately defined the moment. While Donald Trump continued firing off reactions, escalating his tone and doubling down on attacks, Robert De Niro remained composed. There was frustration in his words, even anger, but it felt controlled, grounded in belief rather than impulse. He came across as someone speaking because he felt it was necessary. Trump, on the other hand, appeared driven by the need to push the criticism away, to bury it before it could take hold. And that's where the shift became impossible to ignore. Once people see that kind of contrast, it sticks. One figure appears steady and convinced, while the other seems caught in a loop of reaction. One is identifying behavior. The other is unintentionally demonstrating it in real time. For someone whose public image is built on strength and dominance, that kind of perception is difficult to recover from, because the moment the audience stops interpreting loudness as power and starts recognizing it as insecurity, the entire dynamic changes. The illusion weakens. The influence starts to slip. By the end, it was no longer just about a clash between De Niro and Trump. It became something broader, a reflection of what happens when a well-known voice, with nothing to gain and little to lose, says something plainly in front of millions. Trump may call that disrespect, but what truly challenges him is clarity. Clarity doesn't bend easily, and it's harder to intimidate. De Niro didn't reveal a hidden secret. What he did was outline a pattern, the underlying behavior, the constant need for validation, the tendency to project, the reliance on performance over substance. And once people begin to recognize that pattern, every outburst starts to feel different, less like authority and more like something closer to panic. That's why the reaction was so strong, not simply because of an insult, but because of recognition, because what was said didn't just criticize, it described. And for many watching, it felt uncomfortably accurate.